Right, so nearly 34 billion rand to be invested in the arts in the UK. Journalist and economist Guy Shone is on Skype from London to share his thoughts on this story. Guy, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Peter. Great to be here again.
All right, so $2 billion injection into the arts. It's hard to imagine that the West End in London has been pretty much shut down for weeks now.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, isn't it? You know, so clearly the UK government's decided the show must go on, but they've also been clear that not every part of the arts can actually be saved. You know, we talk about 34 billion. We talk about these numbers a lot. We're almost used to it now. These gigantic figures when it comes to state aid, but equally many of the UK's theatres, heritage sites, music venues, frankly, cost huge amounts to run. And as with many other sectors in the economy, without visitors, without audiences, that leaves a very large financial hole indeed. One that would take, frankly, many billions more to fully repair in its entirety. So the government's being unashamedly tactical here. The culture minister himself, he said the package is really just about preserving what he called the crown jewels, the Royal Albert Hall, as we've seen, the National Galleries, and that sadly many jobs, many institutions either can't or perhaps, frankly, won't actually be saved.
All right, and I suppose when we think about some of the older Victorian-era theatres in the West End that are tiny and cramped, and that's part of its charm, those ones are problematic, particularly when it comes to social distancing.
Yeah, and this is part of the challenge, isn't it? Where you've got the difference between the theory and the reality of what it's like in the real world. And we've already seen some of this with opening of pubs and bars. How do you tell somebody who's had, 10 bottles of lager to stay a metre away from their friends? It's actually quite a difficult thing to try and pull off. And you mentioned the theatres. Those theatres are actually hugely important, though, to the economy, perhaps more important than many people might realise. If you just look at ticket sales for theatres alone last year, it was in excess of $1 billion. They employ something like 300,000 workers, get 30 million annual visitors. And of course the overlap now between these old traditional arts and things like new technology, well, that means that the arts sector has become broader and more influential on the economy than just sort of sales figures and tax payments. The financial tentacles of the arts, so to speak, are now reaching all sorts of different parts of society. Leisure, software development, mental health support. It's a very difficult job for the government to prioritise these so-called crown jewels, because, of course, not everyone agrees what actually is really precious.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose also, given the history, a lot of theatres in London will probably get the nod, but theatres across the country, perhaps lesser known but important to local communities, how does one adjudicate becomes quite a difficult question.
It's becoming it's a sort of political nightmare in effect, because we've got all sorts of tensions. I mean, the UK, for a small island, has got phenomenally complex cultural differences, and it all sort of contained in a relatively small area, and so it's very, very difficult to manage. And we've had some high-level details coming out about how the funds are going to be apportioned. Most of the money is going to be in the form of grants. Some of the money will be in the form of long-term loans. But it's going to be a very, very difficult job, because whoever you end up supporting, inevitably, the flip side is there are going to be groups of people who feel hard done by, who feel that their area or their part of the arts is deemed as less important different than others. And we now see with social media, don't we, that so many people who are so passionate about all aspects of the arts, well, they've got a voice. They can be heard, perhaps in a way that wasn't possible 10 or 20 years ago.
You talked about new media and transitioning a little bit into that. And I suppose what something like COVID-19 does is that it hastens the disruption. And it could be that some theatres just won't come back because people are getting used to a new way of doing things and enjoying entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, just as we've been in the first few weeks of a live experiment to see what happens when people are allowed to go back to physical shops on a grand scale, we're now entering a sort of similar experiment, if you like, with the arts. And it's going to take, a few weeks, a few months to figure out, have they got used to a new way of life? Or are they going to sort of bounce back to how things were? How much of the adjustment, the watching, musicals and various things streaming online, how much of that is because there was no alternative, and how much of it actually is because people are starting to see, well, perhaps we don't need to go to see the live event. So the jury's still out on that, but it is going to be interesting because in lots of sectors we're seeing real life human experiments play out, and the data effectively that comes in the next 3 to 6 months is going to be really interesting about what the future of the arts potentially looks like.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Glastonbury crash and burn, and that is one of these iconic kind of coming togethers, isn't it? I mean, and I just wonder, with social distancing, and I was watching football the other day, and it's just not the same without the crowds there. I mean, it's an essential ingredient. So the theatres may come back, audiences, sizes might be different, but one does get a sense that nothing will really be the same as it was before.
There's a difference, Peter, isn't there, between what people in the industry can celebrate as innovative problem solving, and then what the public actually truly enjoys. I think there's a disconnect there. So it's been, impressive to see how, as you say, algorithms now can generate fake crowd sounds that almost sounds like, the real crowd cheering as players are scoring goals. And similarly with the theatre and musicals, performing arts, we've seen them integrate online connectivity into live performances using artificial intelligence, really, really innovative stuff. The problem comes when you move beyond just other industry people saying, wow, that was clever, well done, and actually try and figure out, what do people really actually enjoy? And it may be that some of these new developments, although they're very clever, very technologically advanced, people perhaps don't just enjoy them. Ultimately, and the audience decides.
All right, and then perhaps finally, what is the situation in terms of COVID-19? Have we got to a gentle easing? What's the situation?
Yeah, the numbers are coming down. There was reports today in Wales, obviously a major part of the UK, that they've seen no deaths today, which has been rightly celebrated. It's still the case that politically Boris Johnson's government is under a lot of pressure for the way that they've handled the overall situation. And there are still people who don't feel that the support that's being offered by the UK Chancellor is actually enough, particularly this cash injection to the arts. Sounds, 34 billion sounds like a huge number, but there are many who are claiming that it should be a lot bigger. So it's still a polarizing situation. Those who have always supported the government have sort of dug their heels in and continue to support them. And to those who've never liked Boris Johnson, it's just another example of him not doing enough and doing it all too late.
All right, Guy, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed. And we'll chat to you again soon, no doubt. All right, that was Guy Shone, who's an economist and a journalist, talking to us from London about this huge $2 billion investment that the British government is putting into the arts to keep this precious sector alive. And a lot of the theatres, iconic ones such as the Royal Albert Hall, to make sure that they don't disappear because of COVID-19.